Once, Marcus Jameson stood before the court, humiliated and helpless. Years later, now in a judge's robe, he watched as the same man who once scorned him pleaded for justice as a lawyer. Marcus ruthlessly exposed his lies. Everything had changed. Marcus Jameson, tall and imposing, stood at the prosecutor's table in the brightly lit courtroom. His dark suit was immaculate, but underneath, he carried a tension he couldn't afford to show. Marcus was more than just a lawyer. He was the voice of those who often went unheard, the voice of justice. His dark, determined eyes were fixed on Judge Carl Edwards, a white man in his 50s, with a cold gaze and slightly graying hair, neatly combed back. The courtroom, steeped in the scent of polished wood and old paper, felt like a living entity. Every movement, every rustle was noticeable. Full benches of jurors, lawyers, and spectators followed every word. The tension hung in the air. The case Marcus was defending involved the excessive use of force by police against a black teenager, a case that had already sparked public outrage. Many eyes were on him, seeing him as the last hope. Marcus began with confidence. His voice was low, but steady as he introduced the case. "Your Honor, I represent a young man whose rights have been grossly violated." He spoke clearly and persuasively, presenting facts backed by video and eyewitness evidence. He knew this case was a chance to show how the system treated black people, how prejudice impacted justice. But Carl Edwards, sitting behind the large wooden judge's bench, seemed unmoved. His face remained impassive, even as Marcus detailed aspects of the incident that would have stirred compassion in any listener. The judge listened with arms crossed, occasionally raising an eyebrow, but it was clear that his mind was already made up. In his gaze, there was a mixture of arrogance and veiled contempt, as if he already knew how it would end. When Marcus began laying out his key arguments, Edwards' expression changed. He abruptly raised his hand, interrupting the lawyer. "Insufficient evidence?" he cut in, his voice striking like a blow. Waving his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a pesky fly, he added, "Case dismissed." Edwards turned to the court clerk, signaling he had no intention of continuing the hearing. A heavy silence fell over the room. Marcus froze, feeling the heat rise in his face, and a painful wave of anger and helplessness constrict his chest. He knew the case wasn't over, but his words had been dismissed with a single wave of a hand. His lips trembled, but he held back, forcing himself not to show the slightest sign of weakness. This wasn't the end, only the beginning. He felt the stares. In that courtroom, there was no sympathy, no justice. Only the cold machinery of a system that had been polished by prejudice for years. Clenching his fists under the table, he raised his head. He knew he would change the system, but it would take more than one case. Marcus understood that he had a long and difficult battle ahead for every small victory, but he was ready. From the moment Judge Edwards dismissed his words, Marcus vowed that one day he would sit where that cold, indifferent man was seated. And he was sure the day would come when justice would be heard, and he would be the one to bring change. After that loss in court, Marcus Jameson felt as if a part of him had been stripped away. The injustice he had witnessed deepened his disillusionment with the system. Yet instead of breaking, he found a new determination within himself. He realized that if the system rejected the truth, he had to become part of the changes no one could ignore. His goal became to be the voice of justice for those the system preferred to overlook. At first, it was small groups of young lawyers whom he gathered in his office. He taught them how to fight bias in the courtroom, how to prove their case in the face of clear injustice. In those seminars, he shared not only legal knowledge, but his own story, his losses and small victories. Marcus sought to inspire young people, to prove that their voices mattered. A key focus of his work became supporting young black people who aspired to legal careers. Marcus created a mentorship program where experienced attorneys served as mentors for students. He found sponsors, secured funding, and organized lectures, workshops, and even mock trials where young lawyers could practice. Over time, his seminars began to attract not only students, but also young attorneys who lacked confidence and support in their professional spheres. The public took notice of Marcus when he organized a large event dedicated to systemic issues in the justice system, where invited experts discussed reforms and young lawyers held discussions about the future of the profession. His name appeared in newspapers. He began to show up on news channels and talk shows, speaking about injustice and the need for change in the legal system. In time, his work drew the attention of influential politicians, who saw in him not only an activist, but a leader. The movement that started with small meetings in a rented office grew into a large-scale campaign for judicial reform. Marcus knew he was becoming the face of change, and the responsibility weighed on him. But alongside it, he felt he was finally on the right path. Soon, his efforts bore fruit. He was offered a judge's position, marking the culmination of his work. The appointment was an unexpected twist. He had transitioned from someone fighting the system to someone who had become part of it. He knew that not everyone around him approved of this decision. Some activists saw his move to the judiciary as a compromise, but Marcus was confident. This was his chance to change the system from within. His first day as a judge was symbolic. He donned the black judge's robe, feeling its weight on his shoulders, and looked at the empty courtroom before the hearing began. This courtroom no longer felt cold and foreign. It was now a place where the truth would finally be heard. Now he could decide fates, and he swore to himself that he would not yield to pressure or prejudice. Marcus knew it would be tough. He faced criticism and resistance from those who preferred the status quo. There were cases where his decisions were met with outrage or even threats, but he remained steadfast. His sense of justice was unwavering, his words deliberate and weighty. He examined each case with special attention, knowing his decisions would become precedents, potentially altering the lives of not just individuals, but entire communities. His transition to the role of judge was a turning point for the system, and he understood that this responsibility had not fallen to him by chance. Now, he had the chance to prove that justice could be more than an idea. It could be a reality reflected in his decisions, each echoing the struggle that began the day he stood before the judge's bench, feeling anger and powerlessness. Now, sitting in that seat, he knew that change was possible, as long as there was someone willing to fight for it to the end. Several years had passed, and Marcus Jameson, once a young lawyer battling the system, now sat as a judge, robed in black, embodying the law. The courtroom that had once overwhelmed him was now his domain. He listened to evidence, deciding fates with authority. One day, Carl Edwards entered the courtroom. Carl, a once confident judge, now defended a police officer accused of mistreating a black citizen. He looked older and nervous, facing Marcus, the man he had once dismissed. Marcus met Carl's gaze coldly, showing no emotion, only professional restraint. Carl, using his old tactics, presented his defense, focusing on minor details to distract from key points. Marcus saw through it, remaining composed as Carl manipulated facts. He waited for the right moments to challenge Carl with precise questions, cutting through the smokescreen. Every time Carl dodged the core issues, Marcus redirected him firmly to the facts. The once insecure lawyer was now a force of authority, and Carl's confidence waned. When Carl grew desperate, he attacked Marcus, calling the trial biased. The courtroom fell silent. Marcus, unfazed, simply asked Carl to sit and focus on evidence. Carl, realizing his defeat, sat down, despair in his eyes. Marcus handled the rest of the trial calmly, ignoring provocations. He guided the jury, explaining the real evidence. This trial symbolized more than a single case. It was a clash between an outdated system, embodied by Carl, and Marcus's vision of justice. When the guilty verdict was delivered, Carl looked down, while Marcus stared straight ahead, feeling the triumph of justice. Years had passed, and Marcus Jameson had transformed from a young lawyer to a judge seated at the heart of the legal system. Now, he presided over cases with authority, wearing the black robe as a symbol of law. The once intimidating courtroom was his domain, a place for truth. One day, the doors opened and Carl Edwards entered. Carl, once a confident judge, now defended a police officer accused of brutality. He looked older, his demeanor uneasy, facing Marcus, the man he had once dismissed. Marcus, behind the solid judge's desk, remained calm. Without a word, he gestured for Carl to begin. Edwards, his voice betraying nerves, used old tactics, dramatic statements, selective facts, and distractions. Marcus, now seasoned, saw through it all. His face impassive, he listened, waiting for the right moment to expose weaknesses in the defense. This time, he held the authority. Each question he posed was precise, cutting to the case's heart. Carl's usual tricks failed. Marcus's firm questions forced him back to the facts repeatedly. "Mr. Edwards," Marcus said firmly, "we discuss evidence here, not theatrics." Carl faltered, his confidence dwindling. Growing desperate, Carl lashed out, accusing Marcus of bias and the trial of being a sham. The courtroom fell silent. Marcus remained calm, his determination unwavering. "Mr. Edwards," he said softly but firmly, "we address facts here, not personal grievances. Please proceed or take your seat." Defeated, Carl sat, understanding he faced a figure of true authority. Marcus carried on, impartial and focused, clarifying the case for the jury without letting Carl's provocations affect him. As the trial ended, Marcus sat alone, reflecting on the journey that brought him here. This trial wasn't just one case. It symbolized the shift from the old ways, embodied by Carl, to a new era of justice. When the jury returned a guilty verdict, the courtroom was silent. Carl, shoulders slumped, did not look up. Marcus, however, looked forward, feeling the quiet triumph of justice.